Section of Plague Tapes 114, which has been recorded on the 16th of November 2021. Are the cabinet still meeting, Andrew?
No idea. Not paying any attention to them.
Okay.
Completely pointless.
Pointless, because they don't make any decisions anyway.
Well, or they just make decisions that are kind of ineffectual and meant to look like they're doing something when they're not. And I think this round it's particularly ridiculous. Probably the big plan is to get pubs to close at midnight.
And that will have a dramatic
effect.
Yeah, I would imagine not.
Yeah.
Okay, so obviously the situation is getting worse. It's going to get worse before it gets better. So what does that mean? What does that translate like in terms of numbers?
Well, one way of looking at it is in the last week, as of last night, we had 28,733 new cases, taking us over 500,000 in total. So that's 10% of the population having tested positive during the pandemic. And the 5-day average of that is 4,436. So essentially we are now at a level of cases that we last saw last January. It had a higher 1-day spike, but we've now had a protracted period with this sort of high level of cases. So that's essentially what we're back to. And if it were not for vaccination, that would be completely devastating in the same way it was then. As it is, it's going to be bad enough, I think. But we'll get a better picture of that in about 3 to 4 weeks. But it's been completely mismanaged and a complete failure to react fast enough as it became obvious that things had not gone to essentially were hopes. So like I think as we've talked about previously, I think you could understand why that particular path was taken and why the risks were taken, but the lack of willingness to recognise things were going wrong as soon as it started and to therefore start stepping back and try and find a stable level, it is completely disastrous. It made no sense and is probably at this stage, I'd say, going to lead us into some form of lockdown, particularly the fact that they've just taken a load of half-hearted efforts today rather than do anything decisive.
Okay, so yesterday, when's the last time we had case count? Yesterday's cases, what was that like?
4,570.
4,570. That's pretty impressive, all right. And ICU has now gone over. Has it gone over?
Yeah,
100?
117 yesterday. I think it's 115 today. And that's increasing quite rapidly. Yesterday's was 150% of the previous Monday's figure. So obviously that can't be sustained in any real sense. Now, because we don't actually have any sort of lockdown in place, that essentially means ICU is now full. Like it did previously in the January peak. I think we got up to 220 or 230. Part of that due to them opening up an additional 30 surge units, which basically meant taking over operating theatres. So because that hasn't happened this time around, and because things are still open, it means like you're still getting your standard level of car accidents and sports injuries and all that sort of other reasons people end up in ICU, and a lot of other surgeries are going ahead. So there's no capacity in terms of what ICU specialist was saying on the radio yesterday. It's a disaster already. They're having to invasively ventilate people outside of ICU settings. It's a mess. And as we know, ICU lags cases by a good 10 days, and that's lagging infections by another 10 days. So if you do something today, that doesn't really have an impact in terms of reducing numbers going into ICU for 20 days. The other thing is that about 81 of those currently in ICU, 81 as of yesterday, were invasively ventilated. So because of the nature of that procedure, that basically, if you don't die, and a large proportion of those people will die, unfortunately, but if you don't, you're probably in ICU for at least 6 weeks. So you have the problem that once you get people going into ICU and a significant proportion are invasively ventilated, there's not going to be any space freed up basically for quite a while. So that also gives you a crisis.
So like they could see that it was going in this way, right? And there was a trajectory that it was on, and they opened up nightclubs, and now they've closed nightclubs again, right? So, in terms of the 10-day lag, where are we at in terms of? Have we dealt with the nightclub opening up? That happened.
That was a little over 3 weeks ago.
3 weeks ago. Okay, so we've definitely got through that 10 days.
Yeah.
So, but then like last week there was full capacity football match in Lansdowne Road.
Yeah.
And then the following day there was a full capacity rugby match. Like that's 100,000 people in the stadium. I know it's outdoors, but like that's.
Well, I mean, the thing about that is it's the problem. I mean, being outdoors right next to other people is a risk in itself. But the main problem actually with those matches isn't necessarily the bit in the stadium, but it's the getting to it and from it on the dart, or the buses, or sharing cars, or whatever else. And then it's going for pints beforehand and going for pints afterwards. And, so if you think about the entire culture that happens around a game, sure, the watching the game bit is outdoors. And is probably the lowest risk element, but there's all that other stuff happening that's definitely not low risk.
That's the normal thing. Yeah. But by holding events like that, like it gives the impression that everything's back to normal, and everything is far from normal.
Yeah, and of course the other thing is, like, when you have those matches on and you've the pubs open, then like there's lots of pubs advertising the fact that we're showing the matches, so those pubs will be crowded and people will be shouting and screaming and doing all this sort of stuff that results in a lot of virus getting released and singing and all the rest of that sort of stuff. So I mean,
so we've just gone through another, like, that's Friday and Saturday, so 10 days from there. It's another raft.
I mean, if it wasn't for that 93% adult vaccination, last weekend would be a complete disaster, right? The question now is, how much of a spike will we see as a result of it? Maybe it won't be that much, maybe it will. We don't really know, because the vaccination does change the dynamics of it all. But it's.
But the other thing is, where you're saying that we're effectively at full capacity now.
Yeah.
So why, when they knew this was happening, why go through anything that would actually trigger a spike? Why not act earlier?
Well, I think that's politics rather than. I mean, I was thinking about that, right? I think part of what we're seeing at the moment is there's this sense there's probably going to be an election coming up soon, and so a lot of them probably feel there's political capital in being associated with opening stuff up, and calling for things to be closed down might be a vote loser. Now, I personally suspect it's not that simple, because I think an awful lot of the population are looking at this and going, "Oh my God!" And one of the interesting things I saw on Twitter was a thread from that Gobshite and Restaurants Association, usual living with COVID stuff, and then various people who own restaurants chipping in, some of them agreeing with them. But a couple of them were giving out about the fact that Holohan, again, just as we had last December, had said, that it wasn't really that safe going out and people should be careful, and said that resulted in them getting lots of bookings cancelled, and so they didn't really like that. But to me, that, I mean, and from talking to, say, my parents or other people who are at risk, they're kind of fully aware that this is not a safe period, so they've naturally enough pulled back and gone out. And but
somebody has to get it in the neck for saying that, and for somebody
some of my
bookings.
Some of my friends who live with vulnerable people, they've stopped going out to stuff. Other people are just not going out, because really it's not that much crack going out if you think there's a high probability of getting COVID as a result of that. I'm in the course of cancelling a plan for the weekend after next myself. So like I don't think either, in that narrow political sense of electoralism, it makes a whole lot of sense, or economically, because what you end up with is restaurants that are at half capacity, with all the people who don't feel they're at risk, basically taking the gamble, and so you're not making the money anyway. So this whole kind of strategy of we can manage high cases, because we'll get an economic benefit from it, has always been questionable, and I think that's probably the case at the moment, and it's also questionable from the point of view that if you don't try and control cases, then they do get out of hand. We've seen this happen a lot of times now. And when they get out of hand, it means you then have to shut down stuff, so that this isn't that different from the argument we've made throughout the pandemic, that actually trying to work out what the level you can safely stay open at is the smart thing to do, rather than to keep taking risks even when it's obvious things are going out of control, because that just gets you back into lockdown. Anyway, endlessly back where we are.
Endlessly back at ground zero,
yeah.
It seems.
So one thing actually, so this gig I was meant to be going to weekend after next, so I was chatting to the person I was going with, and we've gone, it's all looking a bit dodgy, blah blah blah. So I decided I'd go and look at the venue's website and check out what the ventilation or air purification or whatever statement was.
Anything.
Now, this is in the context where in the colleges, if you go, where they've been running lectures for weeks now, but the lecture theatres will have a CO2 monitor on the wall, and there'll be windows open, and ventilation is turned up. And I know somebody was telling me in Maynooth, apparently, if the CO2 monitor goes into the red zone, it actually triggers an alarm in the services, and they send somebody down to the room to open windows or clear it out. So this is the sort of thing that's happening and recognised as having an impact on levels of infection, right, in the setting of a college. So venues, I looked up those statements, and I suspect it's just a cut and paste of the HSE
guidelines,
hospitality guidelines.
Yeah.
There was no mention of ventilation at all. There was no mention of air purification at all. There was no mention of CO2 monitoring at all. What it says is that they're going to clean high contact surfaces. Right, so I imagine a high contact surface is like say a door on the way in or out that everybody's pushing open and shut as they go through. Now, I don't know if that means somebody's going to be standing there cleaning the door after everybody goes through. I suspect not. What it probably means is they'll give it a good clean before and a good clean afterwards, which is, it's completely meaningless theatre.
Useless.
And the thing that struck me is that, okay, like 18 months back, when things were first starting to open up again after the first lockdown, if you'd have said, okay, so what we need to do is install ventilation systems, CO2 monitoring systems, and filtration systems where ventilation won't work, because there's lots of venues, so that's been the case, then probably at that stage people have gone, oh, come on, that's loads of hassle and money, and sure, this is all going to be over in a month or two, so it's not worthwhile.
Here we are 2 years later.
We're in this constant cycle of, oh, this is going to be over soon, it's not worthwhile. But actually, if all that stuff had been done 18 months ago, it probably would have helped a lot, particularly in relation to the level of cases last Christmas. And probably would have meant things could have stayed open for longer, and could have meant things stay open for longer now. So it's kind of, it's this constant short-termism and replacing actual measures that would have some impact with ones that are meant to look good but don't do anything. So we get the perspex screens, we get the hand sanitizer. There's some use to that, mostly in stopping other colds and flus, and perhaps there's some level of cold transmitted by touch, but it's probably not very much. But we get all this sort of stuff, and we don't get the actual measures that might work.
But that's just a reflection of the system we live in, optics and short-termism.
Yeah,
I mean, that's capitalism in a nutshell. The ICU, I wanted to go back to the ICU rates. Are they still running at like 66% non-vaccinated?
The most recent ones, which last Friday, was still roughly two-thirds not vaccinated.
Two-thirds not vaccinated.
Roughly.
And the deaths are now running at something like 75 a week, is that right? But it was 74 notifications. Right.
So it's the usual thing that most of those will not be for that week. They'll be for up to 2 or 3 months previously, and some will even be from further again. But like there's no way we ever know how many people die in a given week. I would imagine that actually there was probably more like 100 deaths last week than 74. But it will take a while for them to come through will take 3 months before they actually come through the system. But if you look at the sort of way they're increasing, and you've sort of a general sense of what a number meant and then what it probably meant in a month and 2 months and 3 months, that would be my expectation. Is we're probably looking at about 100 a week at the moment.
Okay, so we were working on some sort of curve. Remember, there was like an optimistic curve. We've probably obviously totally overshot that.
Yeah, so I've actually...
Where are we going with this?
So the curves I was tracking,
Yeah.
they ended at the start of November, so I ditched them then. And the NEF did do additional modelling, but they said it didn't account for vaccine waning. And they were going to do new models, which apparently the stuff the cabinet got yesterday, I think, with the new models. So I kind of went up. I'm not going to bother doing curve tracking until they produce the new ones, because I've been tracking stuff on a curve I knew didn't actually fit. Now there was a journalist, a woman who writes for the Sunday Business Post. What's her name? Levin, I think, or something. She actually did do a graph I saw the other day that seems to it says we're doing worse than what was expected on those curves, at least in terms of cases. We're doing worse in cases, and I think hospital and ICU a bit towards the centre of what was expected.
Okay, so where do we go now? I mean, we're waiting to see. There's going to be spikes, because like people are I think people are adjusting their behaviour because they're scared, and obviously there's not much leadership going on at the very top in terms of because nothing, like, we're now today is the cabinet meeting. I mean, they've been known about this for the last 2 weeks. Well, pretty much we kind of knew almost straight away after we opened up we could see the after effects of opening up, liberating the nightclubs. But they've done nothing. So 3 weeks. So what's 3 weeks from now going to look like in terms of, because they don't seem to be, any of the measures that they're introducing are going to have a pretty negligible effect on...
Yeah, so, I mean, so if you look at cases, right, the really fast rate of case increase was now 10 days ago, where we were doing kind of like 50%, increase sort of rate. And then, like, before that, NEF had said, oh, things are going wrong here, lads, calm down a bit. And I think, so what happened is a lot of people did calm down a bit.
Yeah, people do
and so
react to that.
Increases this week are more like, let me just check the number before I give it to you.
So effectively, there's been a slowdown.
Yeah, so it kind of went from 50% down to about a 15% week-on-week increase, which is a huge difference, basically, And so what I would expect, and actually it's sort of happening at the moment in terms of new hospital cases have dropped from being a 30 to 40% increase a week down towards about 20%. ICU might have just started to drop. It was 50% week on week yesterday. It's more like 45% today, so that might be part of all that case thing trickling through, which is what we'd expect. There is a problem in that the pattern we've seen with previous waves is that initially they hit young people first, and so what happens is the percentage of cases going to hospital, the percentage of cases going to ICU actually drops, because it's mostly young people. But then inevitably those young people start infecting older people, and so that goes back up again. So we've had that drop, which artificially depressed hospitalizations in ICU, and now those percentages started to climb up again. So we could get a rebound, basically, because of that. So they go up more than in line with
so the drop is only temporary, and then but when they come back stronger, as in they keep going up.
It tends to. So if you think about it, so hospitalizations as a percentage of cases the previous week tend to be around 2.6% if you look at the last 4 months and you averaged it out. However, they move between a bottom of 2.1%, which is what we had about eight days ago, and then they've gone up as high as sort of 4.3% for a couple of days last month, right? And what that is, that's the age, the proportion of
it's
older
working
people
its way to the older people who are needed more.
So when you have lots of school kids getting infected, very few of those go to hospital, so therefore that drops. When they're infecting their grandparents, essentially, that goes back up again. So that's the way that goes. So it's not, you can't perfectly predict from cases what way they're going to be.
Yeah, it's a rolling situation. But yeah, so really, in terms of the global context, where do we sit in terms of incidence? Like we're at something like 1,000. Is that right? 1,000
Above
people
1,000
per
now.
above 1,000. We've never been like that before. We've never got to that stage. We used to be nervous in the early days pre-vaccination when it hit 120.
60.
Now,
if you go
now
back to the summer of 2020.
yeah, now it's 1,000, but
1,074 yesterday. Yeah.
okay,
So 1,074 means 1%
between-
of the population are currently infectious or should be isolating. Whatever.
How many? 1%?
1%, yeah, 1
Okay.
okay. Actually, I was looking at the North figures just before I came up, and they remarkably. So that's 1% is over 14 days, right?
Yeah.
Last week, schoolgirls aged 10 to 14 of them. So just in that week, 1.8% had been infected
1.8% in Northern Ireland
in a single week.
of schoolgirls between the age of 10 and 14.
10 and 14, yeah. Because
Okay.
basically after the half term, there was a thing that happened 2 weeks back where all across the UK cases started to drop, and so
Yeah, there was
loads
this
of people,
big thing of going like, oh, finally, we're over the spike.
Yeah.
Like, it's now definitely going to end.
Yeah. You know, the idea they'd hit some sort of herd immunity or population immunity level, and the kind of people who are following the stats a bit closer were going, hang on, it's half term. There's normally a drop at half term. Let's wait a bit, and then people were kind of getting really annoyed with them for saying that. And actually, what we've seen in the last 4 or 5 days is, yes, cases are going back up again. The case of the North are going up really fast, actually. So, yeah, it's
This herd immunity is like a unicorn that they keep talking about. That never has actually ever appeared once.
Again, if you go back to our shows that we were doing in, say, June 2020, right?
Yeah.
I was probably explaining why I thought people who thought Sweden had reached herd immunity
Yeah, there was like
in June
there was
2020
always
were
like
wrong,
somebody was
right?
chasing it. Yeah.
Because some people were trying to say back then that 20% of the population having tested positive would be enough. And yeah, I think what we found out since, and to be fair, like what we didn't know then was how quickly people would be reinfected.
Yeah.
We didn't at that stage have a clue that we were going to get different variants that were actually much more infectious, and that pushes up the herd immunity level. So it's not like the people who thought 20% would be enough were wrong, but things have changed since that. You know.
Yeah, there's more.
It
becomes the longer it goes on, the more multifactorial. But the only thing that I can say about herd immunity is everywhere where they said herd immunity could possibly be, it could be a case of that. Invariably, what we ended up was a variant. Like, I mean, it almost felt like herd immunity maybe has been reached in South Africa, it's been reached in Brazil, and then suddenly we got variants coming from the same places that's supposed to have hit herd immunity.
Well, and actually, that is kind of what you'd expect, because when you get a lot of immunity in a population, then the variants of the virus that will do better are the ones that can either reproduce faster or have some immune evasion or whatever else. So yeah, it's a problem that, I mean, it's one of the problems with using infection as a concept for building immunity, that actually that doesn't really work. Like, it has an effect on slowing down infection. That depends really on how long that immunity lasts for. But somebody was pointing out today, if you look at smallpox, right? If you look at a graph of smallpox measured literally over centuries, now smallpox was really deadly, could kill up to a third of the people it infected. And if you look at, and it was here for hundreds of years, right? And we eliminated it with vaccination, right? Yeah. But what you saw was,
I think I've got a big mark up
here. Yeah. You have the age, you'd have that. But what you see basically, if you graph smallpox incidence over hundreds of years, it's just it spikes up, down, and it's just one wave or the other going for hundreds of years. It never reached a population immunity in any sort of lasting sense.
Okay, so there's a good example of why chase this idea.
There aren't any diseases that have been eliminated through population immunity. What population, what survival immunity, infection immunity, whatever you want to call it, means. It means it goes up, immunity builds up, it goes down, immunity fades, it goes up, immunity builds up, it goes down. So in other words, you just continuously get waves that come and go and come and go, and that goes on for a long period of time. Now, probably what happens...
That sounds very familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah. Probably what happens is it kills off the more susceptible people, and therefore maybe over generations you get people who are less susceptible to the disease become the majority of the population. Although with smallpox that didn't really happen, so you can't even assume that.
Yeah. I mean, we can't wait for generations, because, Christmas is coming.
Well,
we should all get back to normal.
Also, and the other problem is that method of reaching some sort of resistance involves not only people dying, but it's 70-year-olds dying or 60-year-olds dying won't impact it. You need people of breeding age to be the ones that are dying. So it's not really it's not a path out of this for us. I talked to, in the previous show, I talked about this genetic evidence of a major coronavirus epidemic in Asia 20,000 years ago that seems to have lasted for hundreds of years through multiple generations. But that was selecting. That's why they can see it. It left a marker of genetic selection when you do sequencing from back then. But that presumably what it was doing was every time it came through, it was killing 5% of people of breeding age. Not sure breeding age is the right term, but and then so that happens for a long period of time, and then left a population at the end that had a greater level of resistance than had it at the start. But it's not really an exit from this.
So, but that's the now the exit feels like such. It also feels like some sort of cloud, wishing on a star kind of thinking, because it seems now we're in another cycle where we're kind of witnessing the slow build up of those who couldn't get vaccinated, right? So it was amongst the kids, the prevalence of it amongst students, in spite of the fact that they have ventilation systems and stuff like that. Obviously, it's spreading amongst students because they party in rooms that aren't ventilated. So we're witnessing this, and now we're seeing it's pretty much like the summer.
No, I know the ventilation isn't magic; it doesn't stop transmission dead. It just reduces it.
Yeah. But so we're witnessing this slow build up, and now we're witnessing it starting creeping through the generations, getting to the more vulnerable. It's so we are kind of bottoming out and then bouncing back up again. And this is a pattern that we've seen. So where do we go from here in terms of that's my point about 3 weeks from now? Where are we going to be at another peak in the proceedings? And is it all just basically boiling back down to people taking it seems ludicrous, but it seems like the only thing that people are able to do is pay attention and not go out, not circulate because the incidence is too high. Is that where we're at?
Okay, so this is going to be a not good news section. So I'll start with the good news.
It was never going to be good news.
So I'll start with the good news, which is the good news is I think the worst of the pandemic is definitively behind us, right? And by that I mean the period where if you didn't take very extreme measures, then lots of people died very quickly. So that, because of vaccination, is now behind us, right?
Yeah.
That's the good news.
That's the 93% doing its job.
Yeah. The bad news is that because Delta is so infectious, and because immunity, whether it comes through vaccination or through surviving against infection and transmission wanes, right? So that means that if you're vaccinated, you can catch it, and if you catch it at some level, you can transmit it onwards. Probably vaccinated people are transmitting onwards at a much lower rate. I think we might have talked about that at a previous show. But the problem is with Delta, if you've no measures in place, then on average, an unvaccinated person will infect 6 people, right? So even if a vaccinated person transmits at only a quarter of the rate, that's still 1.5 people, and that's more than enough to get exponential growth, right? So that's the problem we're looking at. Is that appears to be the situation, that you probably have a 3, 4, 5 month window where if you're vaccinated, you don't get infected and you don't transmit at all. And then that protection against infection wanes, protection against disease, hospitalization, all that holds up, so that protects you individually, but it doesn't protect you from infecting others.
Yeah, so
That's,
you're a carrier, you're a vector.
Okay, so that's one half of our problem.
Right.
The other half of our problem is that we know from the deaths of vaccinated people we're seeing, we know from the fact that a third of people in ICU are unvaccinated, are vaccinated, right?
Yeah.
That actually, at the level of society, that adds up to a lot of people who the vaccines don't work well enough for. They're protecting, it's easiest to express it this way, if we think about it as them protecting 95% of people, and then there's 5% who aren't protected, right? The actual truth to that is a little bit more complex. There's some people who are not protected because they're immunocompromised, for instance, and then with other people it's just sometimes you're bad luck. You have a high exposure and you get infected because of a high exposure or whatever other reasons. We haven't unpicked all that yet, but mathematically it's easiest to understand if we think there's 5% who aren't protected, and we know that 5% are people who are older and people who have certain underlying medical conditions, particularly anybody who's immunocompromised, and also, I think importantly, because I don't think people have thought about this enough, people who are going through particular medical procedures, right, that you'd normally expect reasonable survival rates from. So we're thinking about, say, transplants are an obvious one because you have to suppress people's immune systems for transplants to happen. Cancer treatments, same reason. You're both deliberately suppressing immune systems, but also chemo tends to undermine them as well. If you're going into surgery or coming out of surgery, so there's a whole load of. If you think about it in terms of the existing problem we had with MRSA in hospitals, right? We understood that there's a whole load of conditions where somebody might be kind of healthy enough on a day-to-day basis. There's something wrong with them, but they're healthy enough. But if they're in hospital for a particular procedure and they get MRSA, it kills them, or there's a reasonable chance of killing them, right?
Yeah.
And the problem we have with COVID is exactly the same problem, but it's much more infectious, right? Because it's airborne, essentially.
Yeah.
So therefore, the problem we have going forward is you have that combination of people can be infectious and spread it around, and most of us, that doesn't matter most of the time. You get a bad cold, maybe, or it's actually a very nasty cold is what some people experience it as. But unfortunately, there's a whole sizable enough segment of the population where if they catch it, it can send them to ICU, it can kill them. And that, in terms of the way they were thinking of being able to return to normal, that's where the problem lies. That the only way you can protect those people at a reasonably high level is not have COVID circulate in large quantities. That, I think, is what we're looking at, which means having to control cases. So,
but also, doesn't this leave us in a situation where almost every hospital in the country is gonna have COVID?
Yeah.
As it's just going to be part of the operating environment now, because if you're treating people, staff are going to get infected, wards are going to get infected.
Yeah.
So
the people themselves will have it and not know they have it.
Yeah.
No, and I mean, I think at this stage we can say fairly confidently it's going to be worse in the summer than the winter. The cycle of waning immunity to infection will mean you'll get peaks that will coincide with winter, and this becomes a really big problem to actually. What do you do? How do you handle it? And I think that's why...
Worse in the winter or the summer? What did you say?
Winter, it's
worse in the winter.
Yeah, I mean, it's not... Why? It doesn't really matter exactly. It could just simply be because we tend to be forced indoors in the winter, so there's more opportunity for transmission. I mean, we'll have more detail to that at the time. But I think what it's beginning to look like is that accepting COVID being around means accepting waves of COVID in the winter that will have serious repercussions for anybody who's vulnerable to it. And trying to control those waves, or trying to just at least stop those people getting infected, will mean on an ongoing basis we'll need a lot of testing. We'll probably need measures for when things get out of hand. All those things, in other words, are probably with us to some extent for a while. What we might hope is that anybody who gets exposed and is, let's say under 70 at the moment, right, will build up immunity that actually lasts, that accumulates to more. And so we could probably confidently say that, let's pick a 15-year-old who's been vaccinated at this stage, right?
Yeah.
That they'll then get, in this scenario, they get infected with COVID every 2 to 3 years, probably be what you'd expect. And it could well be that by the time they hit 70, actually they're not in that bad a position because their body at that point has a really broad response to it. Yeah. The problem is if you're currently, say, 60, your immune system is already not as agile as it used to be. You may never develop that response, so you may remain permanently very vulnerable to COVID, and that vulnerability increases as you get older. So at the moment, life expectancy in the countries that have been hard hit, like say Russia or the States, have been cut by about 2 years.
Right.
But actually, that could turn out to be 5 years or 10 years. It could be the point that
it's impossible to say if it isn't ended. If we don't have an end point.
Yeah. This is the problem.
We're still in it.
That there's definitely the sort of bad case scenario to that is that relatively few people who are now 70 will see 80, and almost none of those will see 90. Where we had got to the point in Western societies where that had become very common.
Yeah.
That's a possibility. It's also possible though that mightn't be the way it goes. It might be that you still build up enough immunity to survive later attacks. It's certainly the case that like the antivirals that are currently being developed,
the pills.
Yeah, there's a lot of promise with them if they catch it early. They seem to cut mortality by about 90%. Okay. Right now, again, in that case, that still means you need the ongoing surveillance because you need to know somebody has COVID fast because you have to get it. You have to get them on treatment within about 5 days of spotting it. They cost a course of treatment, I think, currently costs about £600, so it's expensive enough. Yeah. It's a lot cheaper than somebody going to hospital or whatever. But that's expensive enough that you can't simply just give everybody it in winter or something like that. And the pills themselves cut transmission, so in vulnerable settings like hospitals and things, that might help you control it. But like I think what we're looking at is we kind of like this time last year as news of vaccines was coming out and up as late as the summer, we were kind of going, oh, this is great. These vaccines are so effective, they're going to bring an end to this. Mm-hmm. And instead what we're looking at is, no, they've taken the sting out of it. And I think it's important to acknowledge that because otherwise we'd be in a much situation now than we are. But we really are going to have this ongoing problem that we don't know
really
how
big
it's going to be.
Long,
and we still don't,
tail.
We still don't really know what the long-term implications of being infected and surviving are, all those sort of things.
Yeah, of course.
One bit of good news is that New York ear doctor I was listening, I follow, does the show every week. He was saying he was on a big medical call with, thousands of doctors in the States, and that they don't think they're really seeing long COVID in people who've been vaccinated. Right. And the host was saying, well, how many people would that be? And he said, it'll probably be millions of people who've, been vaccinated, got infected, and they haven't seen it yet. So that might be one optimistic thing, but we'll see. And we also don't know if that protection will hold after 6 months, 8 months, 10 months.
Okay, so when people talk about the waning of the vaccine, is that the waning? Does that really impact in terms of people transmitting? Is that the main part?
It's most obvious in terms of transmission, right? However, there's at least some waning in terms of protection against disease, going to ICU and death as well, right? Part of the reason we don't have very solid figures on that is most people have been vaccinated. Very few people have been vaccinated a year at this stage.
Yeah, of course.
So we don't know what's happening in 2 years' time. And we won't know. We know from kind of the countries like Israel that had a lot of vaccine early, or the UK, that there is a definite reduction. It's particularly strong with older people, which is why the initial booster program was aimed at people over 60 or whatever. But I don't think we've a real sense of it. The other thing to say is that with this third dose, we still don't actually know if it's a booster, i.e. something that will need to be given on a regular basis to boost your immunity again, or whether it might turn out to be that actually vaccination against COVID is a 3-dose vaccine.
Right.
Because in fact there are other existing vaccines that involve 3 doses separated over time. I think there's even one that involves 4 doses. So that it's not impossible that we'll discover that, actually 3 doses and that locks enough immunity in to keep going. I wouldn't, so like there's loads of, again, this has been the case the last 2 years. We don't know. in terms of answers to a lot of those questions, and we won't know until we go through it.
Okay, so we're into the next. Like, before we do a show, we'll probably end up doing a show because people are breathing down our necks for shows. But pretty soon. But are we in a cycle now where forget about those who are gonna ask for your vote, or the simplicity, the simple-minded, stay open or close the economy, blah 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 nonsense. But what are we supposed to do for ourselves? We're just basically supposed to make calculated risks in terms of saying, I'm not going out, I'm staying in. Like, I mean, it all seems to have been pushed back onto the individuals. I mean, what do we do for the next couple of weeks?
So this is the problem with the phase we're in, right? And there's a disconnect between what I just said about it kind of looks like this is going to be around a while, keep coming back.
Yeah, it is.
And that ideas of behaviours as a countermeasure, because the behaviours as a countermeasure doesn't really make a lot of sense if this is going to be around for years.
It is.
Because people just aren't going to sustain that. And I think that approach was...
That's the nub of the entire problem,
Yeah.
because the whole trajectory about us going back to normal, it's like they've opened everything up so things are normal. We are allowed to go to football matches. We are allowed to go to the pub beforehand. We're allowed to go to the nightclub. But then it's all on us. If we get COVID, it's all on us. And that's the kind of ludicrous part of it, because we shouldn't have got to normal if we knew it was going to continue like this. And
well, I don't think... See, I think part of the problem is that
we couldn't have
a lot of what I'm said
Yeah.
wasn't known. And maybe isn't known. I mean, I think some of that is controversial. That might be a worst case scenario.
Yeah.
Maybe there's still some hope that actually we fill in that immunity gap in terms of the people who haven't got vaccinated and it works out. Or more realistically, vaccines get approved for younger age groups. You vaccinate the whole population, and that gets enough control with maybe a third dose that transmission gets to be less. I mean, essentially, in order for it to become not a problem, you have to get to a situation where R stays at or around 1, right? It can go a bit above 1 some of the time. You can get waves, but they're not that big.
Yeah.
And then it goes below 1, and that keeps things under control. And if you think about it, like, say, flu, that's more or less the situation with flu. It tends to be above 1 in the winter, below 1 in the summer.
Yeah.
You get waves of flu that are quite disruptive to medical care in the winter, but they're not like the COVID waves we're seeing, where they're absolutely huge. They're waves where, you're talking about thousands of people getting infected rather than tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
So that's the problem with COVID, because it's so infectious. It just infects too many people too quickly.
Yeah.
And that's what's causing the problem. I mean, the post-vaccination IFR may not be that different from flu, infection fatality rate. I think it actually is about twice as high. So it's not, the problem post-vaccination is not that if you measured it in deaths per 1,000, it's particularly bad in comparison with other things. The problem is that it remains very infectious. And so that rather than infecting 10 or 50,000 people in a season, it infects 1 million or 1.5 million. So that's the problem. Where we are at the moment, in terms of behaviours and things, I mean, that's essentially it. That, like, in fact, it's a microcosm of what I just said. What we need to do is have her down around 1, a little bit below 1 ideally. At the moment, it's probably been running at 1.5 for, about a month or more. And if that happens, well, then things can stay as they are, basically. So this, I think, and this brings me back to the ventilation and all the other stuff. So at the moment, the problem really is that the ideas for trying to get the R value down around 1 is, 1, vaccination, actually very effective, probably has a really big impact. Maybe it cuts that 6 into 1.5 or whatever. Maybe it doesn't do that for much more than 6 months.
We know it doesn't work at 92%.
Yeah,
we've found that out, haven't we?
Yeah, but quite effective. Vaccination, wearing masks in crowded spaces. Yeah, that definitely has some effect. The problem is at the moment is lots of people are not bothering because they think it's over, or they're wearing them on their chins or whatever. But also there is an issue that, in fact, that when they brought masks in, the need to get people to wear anything meant that they didn't really suggest to people that actually, loose fitting close masks don't do very much for yourself. If you cough, okay, they catch stuff or whatever, So what some countries like Germany have done is they've said, okay, we want people to wear proper masks, so like N95s or whatever. Now obviously people are going to be wearing them, that they're not going to be going through a fit process, they're not going to be getting the 95% filtration out of it, but they might get 80% rather than the 20% of a cloth mask. So that's something you could do.
By the way, have they said, they haven't issued anything around people wearing those type of masks on public transport?
No,
it's like, no.
No, I think they haven't. At the start of the pandemic, you had the reasonable excuse that you didn't want to start using up supplies that were needed for medical workers for that end. That at this stage strikes me as being less true. I wonder if part of it is they're worried if they say that's what you have to wear, that then they're going to have to pay for them or subsidise them or whatever else, Right. But anyway, so that's another thing. And then most of the recommendations are beyond. Oh yeah, and obviously not meeting too many people. That's the other thing, right? Problem with that last one is that kind of works for short periods of time when people are really freaked out. It's not going to be sustainable, because what people want to do is gather in big crowds.
Well, that's the problem. Like, we're going into Christmas.
Yeah.
Like, it's the end of November. People don't want to go have another Christmas like last Christmas. Yeah.
Yes.
And you don't have to do that now because everything is open.
Yeah, yeah.
I want to go to a football match, and now I don't know if I can go to a football match because
and a lot of
there'll
people,
be all these pinch points.
I mean,
like, what's the...
People react to that in different ways. Some people will do it based on what they perceive as personal risk to themselves. So that means lots of older people are back in isolation, for instance, right? Some people will do it purely... Some people doing it on the basis of personal risk to themselves will have the perception that personal risk is close to zero because they're young, maybe they're vaccinated or whatever. So they're just going to keep doing what they want to do anyway. And then some people will have some sort of level of, I don't like the hospitals sort of running out of space, so I'm going to switch from meeting a lot of people to meeting a few people. It's probably quite a lot. That's probably a large majority of people are kind of looking at it from some sort of collective point of view. But as I said, that's limited. So I think in terms of going forward, what they have to do is go, okay, what else can we do to improve the situation somewhat that actually isn't too intrusive on day-to-day life? Ventilation, CO2 monitoring, air purification is one really obvious one. It's not free. It's going to cost something. They probably don't like it because it will cost businesses something in particular. But it's not insanely expensive. I mean, air filtration units that can handle a classroom, you're talking about a few hundred, CO2 monitors, you're talking about £100. Like these things are not very expensive in themselves. And then the other thing you can do is encourage a lot of self-testing. So the antigen testing kits. Now, with that, so the problem with those is that there tends to be a lobbyist push for those as a way of encouraging people to take risk and trying to stay open despite the risks involved. So there was a funny thing last night with Twisted Pepper, the nightclub, announced they were going to require an negative antigen test to enter, right? I was kind of, what the hell is that about? And I suspect what that was about is they got wind that the government today were going to close nightclubs, and so that was a way of them going, no, we can do this thing to allow us to stay open. Right. Okay. So I was having this conversation in relation to gigs and stuff, and saying I don't think they'd work very well like that, because basically it's not that difficult to get a negative. If you want to get a negative, you just don't do a bad swab, or don't do one at all. Just run the buffer through it, and that'll give you a control line. So that'll give you a parent negative.
True. That's not,
the pilots they did with antigen testing for nightclubs in England and Liverpool in particular. They found they found one person, for instance, who took several tests until he got a negative, and then used that for entry. Most
type of
people,
person who want to go to a nightclub are the type of people who want to have a negative antigen test. They don't want to be told you can't go because you're positive.
Exactly, and the thing is, like, maybe 95% of people wouldn't do that, but 5% would, and the 5% who are probably engaged in the riskiest behaviour anyway.
They're the ones who are coming up and giving you a hug.
Yeah, so I'm not particularly convinced that they'd be that useful as a way of controlling exposure on entry. However, as I said, what the point we're going forward to is this situation where probably most of the population, most of the time, is not that vulnerable to COVID. But a section of the population are. So really, I think the main use of the antigen testing type stuff isn't to allow risky things to happen, but rather if you've done something risky, gone to a nightclub or whatever else, or a party, or because a lot of the times you might go to something as well and actually it turns out to be not quite what you expected. You know, some of your experience to go to the cinema where it was actually full, for instance, maybe a bit like that, and so what people in that situation could do is test themselves afterwards, and in particular test themselves, say if they're going to visit parents or grandparents or medically vulnerable people or whatever else, get a detection earlier than they would otherwise, and therefore that chain of transmission gets broken. You know, so but in order to do that, like at the moment they cost about £6 a pop. So lots of people aren't going to be able to afford to do that. So therefore what you need to do is what they've done in some countries of making them free, essentially, or very, very cheap, if not free. You know, so like I think that the problem is that all of this should have been done in advance of this experiment of opening up. That filtration systems, like the air quality stuff, is not that different from saying a restaurant or a takeaway has to prepare food on a stainless steel surface, you know, and has to have a proper fridge, and you inspect places to make sure that's the case, and if it's not the case, they can be fined and they can be shut down if they're really bad. Right, so I think essentially what we need, because as I said, I think we're looking at this going on for a couple of years, we need, for commercial buildings, they have to meet air quality standards, basically, right? That needs to be inspected and enforced, right? And that would probably make a very big difference in terms of cutting down that transmission. And then you also roll out, you know, easy to access, preferably free, at home testing, and people can use that afterwards. To reduce their contact if infections with
responsible people will and irresponsible people won't, and that's always going to be.
Well, you have a bit of a problem with that, but also I think even irresponsible person, right? You would probably be far more inclined to test yourself after an event rather than test yourself before it, you know, and take a positive seriously afterwards, where before it you might go, oh no, not really, I really want to go to this. You know, so I think that's, and it needs a kind of education program or whatever else alongside that, so people have a better understanding of risk, because I think the big problem with, like, in terms of public reaction to the current restrictions and the midnight closing thing, which is it's kind of ludicrous, but also every time this happens, you get this annoying thing where you get lots of smart houses going, oh, the virus doesn't infect people, only infects people after midnight, or whatever. And there's an issue that people are far too comfortable with being told you can do this or you can't do that. And what they want is really consistent rules. Okay, so nobody can be indoors and have a pint. That's it. Or everybody can, and there should be no limits on it. Like, that's kind of like a lot of people, they seem to see, they either want that or they want that. And that doesn't work in terms of what we're going to be going through, because if we do it that way, all that happens is we get periods where we can open up, and then we get a big wave, and then we have periods where we have to go into lockdown. That's kind of rubbish. And rather, in fact, precisely what you're looking at is that measure of, well, how much can we do? You know, what limitations do we have to place on that, and hopefully voluntary ones rather than compulsory ones that will enable us to just keep stuff open. Maybe you need a little bit more measure in the winter, maybe a bit less in the summer, but like that sort of setup, rather than this sort of thing. I want the government to either lock me down or let me do everything. Which I don't think is the way. It's not going to get us through this in a pleasant manner. No, basically.
but I mean, none of that stuff is on the agenda today. They're not discussing things like antigen testing. They're not.
Well, they are, but in a kind of meaningless.
Well, that's what I mean. Like, so, like, it's almost like our expectations of anything like this being delivered it's because the way that they operate is kind of like sledgehammer. It's either do something or do nothing, and they seem to specialize in doing nothing up to a point where they have to do something.
There's a real.
This
has just crossed my mind now. But if you remember the 1991 American invasion of Iraq, rather famously, when that invasion was being planned, there were quite a few American generals were going, whatever about the invasion, occupation afterwards is going to be really hard and expensive.
Yeah.
So they wanted to plan for what an occupation would look like, and they got fired.
Right.
Like basically, if you
That's
started
the really
planning
awkward question.
for what an occupation would look like and saw what the cost of it was, that's it. You were no longer a general, and somebody else was put in your place who didn't do that.
And that's how we ended up with Storm and Norman Schwartz.
That's how we ended up with ISIS and all that sort of.
Everything
Because
else.
if you think of everything that came out of that
Yeah.
occupation and the disaster that it became, and I think there's been a similar governmental approach to COVID in that there's never any planning for effective offsetting of risk taking.
Yeah.
As it's happening, things have got to go wrong as they are at the moment, and
Yeah.
once things have gone wrong long enough, then you end up having to have some form of lockdown and
Yeah, you have to
restrictions
do
again.
something. Yeah,
And at
that's
that
the way
point,
it
there's
is,
a
yeah.
discussion about, well, maybe what can we do?
I know.
And then that typically then gets implemented in some half-assed manner, like the mandatory hotel quarantine,
Yeah.
like the €9 meal, like we've had a whole set of
We
these
have a
things
series,
that are meant to do something, but actually they're pretty obviously ineffective because otherwise there's costs associated with it, and that seems to be what they desperately don't want to have is
No
excess
cost for business.
Mm.
Wow. That's great, Andrew. Great. Can't wait to do 115 in a couple of weeks' time.
Yeah. Maybe it'll be far enough away that things will have got slightly better. We'll see.
We'll see. Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much.
Right.
Those.